Hello everyone, today I'm going to be sharing my GoPro settings with you. I've been perfecting these over the last couple years and you would have seen them in action throughout all my videos this past winter. We're going to do this while we drive from Vancouver to Rossland for my good friends Jade and Sydney's wedding. It's 8 a.m. now, we have to be there by 4:30 and it's probably going to take about all that time to get there. Put 8.5 hours on the clock and get going. Oh, put it into third. Oh, I did third again. There we go. That's drive. See you later. All right, the rain has finally stopped. We can finally get down to business. We're just over halfway there. With 3 hours to go, I think we should make it on time. So I have two main presets set up on my GoPro. I have the top one, standard, which is what I use for follow cams anytime the camera is mounted to a pole. And then I have activity, which is for POV. So both of these presets are at 4K resolution and 60 frames per second. Hopping into the standard preset, I love the wide lens for follow cams. It's just wide enough to always keep the rider in frame, but close enough to feel like you're there with the action. And then we have our Hypersmooth settings. I keep those on standard. Now if we scroll down, this is where we're really gonna get into it. I have Pro Tune turned on, and I'm gonna break down the methodology between why I set my GoPro up like this for these settings to make more sense. So to set the exposure on my camera, I start with looking at my frame rate. We have a 60 frames per second frame rate. Now I use the cinematic 180-degree rule, which means that whatever your frame rate is, your shutter speed should be double that. So we have a 60 frames per second frame rate, which means we'll have a 1/120th shutter speed. This will stay constant. This is always what my GoPro is set up as. And with this setting fixed, that only leaves us a couple options for managing the amount of light that comes into our camera. We have ISO, and then we have the use of ND filters. Keeping your ISO as low as possible is gonna give you the cleanest image. So we're gonna bump that all the way down to 100. And even with the ISO at its lowest setting, it's likely still gonna be too bright, especially when you're on snow. And so this is where ND filters come in. ND filters are like sunglasses for your camera. I have these ones from Polar Pro, and they come in 3 different strengths, kind of like different lenses for your goggles. We have the ND8, which lets the most amount of light in. You can consider this like a yellow lens. And then we have our 16, which is sort of your mixed light lens, and then your 32, which is like your full-blown sunny day, dark as you got. So I will use the ND filters dependent on the brightness of the day to set the exposure on my GoPro. My general rule of thumb for these ND filters, just like I said with the lenses, the 8 is only for really dark mornings or sunsets maybe. The 16 is the one I run almost all of the time. It's for all mixed kind of lights and you can get away with it into pretty bright conditions. If there's not a cloud in the sky, the 32 is perfect and you won't have to worry about blowing anything out. And this is where I'm gonna let you in on the secret sauce with the GoPro. And this is something I've learned over the last couple of years that I haven't seen in many other people's videos. Most people, when they're setting up their GoPro like this, will lock the minimum ISO and the maximum ISO at 100 to get the cleanest image. But with how good these new GoPros are getting, especially the 9s and 10s, I've been bumping that max ISO up to either 800 or even 1600, and the image is still very clean. Sorry, I had to bump my ISO. Don't have the auto ISO like the GoPro. In that circumstance, the GoPro would have bumped the ISO value up to get the correct exposure for the camera. And that's what's fantastic, especially when you're set up as a POV or dealing with variable light conditions, is the GoPro is always changing in a nice little controlled range, and you're still getting a really clean image. Nothing's worse than shooting something really good and getting home and figuring out that you blew it out or it was underexposed. That just sucks. So having this nice variability with the GoPro still gives you like the benefits of having some auto settings with it, but with the nice cinematics of a fixed shutter speed. Now you might be asking, why would I fix my shutter speed? What is the benefit of doing that? Why? And using that 180-degree rule gives you a nice cinematic motion blur. I'm gonna set my GoPro up in my truck here and I'm gonna show you the difference between the auto settings, a 1/120th shutter speed, and all the way down to a 1/50th shutter speed, which you would use for, say, 24 frames per second, which is like the cinematic Hollywood standard. I found for me personally, especially with GoPro footage and things moving so fast, the 1/120th is that nice middle ground where you have good cinematic motion blur, but you can actually tell what's going on. I find with the 1/50th, everything's blurry and you can't get a good clear image. Now opposed to the auto settings where everything is very sharp. And the negative effect of that is it has a hard time showing the viewer what speed is. So if you ever got home and you thought, wow, I thought I was ripping and your footage looks really slow, sometimes it has to do with the lack of motion blur. So now that we've run through the exposure methodology, we can get to the rest of the settings. I set my bitrate to high. One thing I forgot to mention is for my standard preset for follow cams. I also have the frame size set to 4:3. This also gives you room on the top and the bottom of the frame when you put it on a 16:9 timeline. That's what you're watching this video in. This is 16:9. 4:3 is just a bit bigger. And so if you do, you know, kind of cut his head off or cut his feet off on the 16:9, the 4:3 is bigger and you actually have room to get that back. So it's just like giving you flexibility in post to make sure you capture all the shots. That's how I try and set up my GoPro, is so that I can go out there and be confident in the fact that when I get home, we're gonna have the shots. My white balance, I keep locked at 5500 Kelvin. That's the color temperature of daylight. I like to do that because dealing with snow, your GoPro will tend to expose it a bit too warm. Everything will either have like an orange hue or kind of like a grayish tint. I like the sky to look blue and the snow to look white, or even a bit on the bluer side. You'll notice in the morning, actually, if you take a good look, the snow will actually be quite blue in the shadows. That is the only somewhat downside, is in the morning, you will notice that blue tinge to your snow, but it's more color accurate. And as the day goes on, it's gonna look better and better. It also adds more flexibility in post too, because since your white balance is set the same throughout the day, when you decide to color grade it, you can make one change that will affect all the clips evenly. If you leave it on auto, it's gonna be changing that color temperature all throughout the day, and it's gonna be very hard to correct in post. I keep my sharpness on low. This is because I add sharpening in post. If you don't want to do that, I recommend medium. I use that for a bunch of years. That's still a really clean look that requires no work in post. I have my color profile set to flat. This gives me the most range in post-production, and I prefer this image over the other two color settings. If you want something that has a bit more saturation right out the box, I would try natural, but personally I don't like to go as far as the kind of GoPro color. For the wind setting, I keep the mics on auto, and this is where I want to dive in what I do to my GoPro to modify it to get the best audio out of it. Capturing audio on a GoPro is difficult, even after the improvements they've made over recent years. For my follow cam setups, I use GoPro's pass-through door to plug in their 3.5mm mic adapter and then connect that to a cheaper Rode video mic. I've used the Video Micro in recent years, and now I've just upgraded to their Video Mic Go 2. It's just a bit more directional. So if you are on a follow cam setup, I would recommend using an external microphone. Now, the reason I don't use their Media Mod is because I don't like the onboard Media Mod mic, and it also restricts me from doing this one thing that I do to set it up for POV. I use these Rycut micro windjammers. They're just stick-on dead cats that you can cover your GoPro mics with and greatly reduce the wind noise and improve the audio on your GoPro. Because you've now covered the front, the top, and the side, you would have to remove those to add the Media Mod, and I think this provides better audio in a smaller package in the first place. To mount my microphone as well as my 3.5mm mic adapter to my pole, I've made my own little mic bracket. It's out of a ski strap and a piece of aluminum with a cold shoe mount on it. This is also what I use to mount an external power bank to my pole. Battery life is one of the most difficult things about using a GoPro. Standard batteries, frankly, suck. I've had a lot of issues with them this winter. So using an external power bank makes your day a breeze. You can plug it directly through that 3.5mm mic adapter into the camera and power your camera all day long without worrying about battery life. I tend to actually leave my GoPro on all day, not filming, but on, so that it keeps the camera warm, because they really don't like to get cold. And keeping them on keeps the sensors warm, keeps the thing operating. And with these power banks, you could run it 10 hours straight without running out of battery. Now, you're not going to use the power bank when the thing's mounted to your head. It would just be too heavy. So that's where the Enduro battery comes into play. They made some really good improvements with that Enduro battery. And as much as they're a real pain to get your hands on in Canada, I would highly recommend them if you plan on using your GoPro in the snow, as you actually have a chance of making it throughout the day. I tend to bring 3 with me. That will usually get me through a powder day or until my card's full. For SD cards, if you're looking for a recommendation, I would stay away from the SanDisk that the GoPro ships with. I bought this really nice pro grade card. It's what I use in this big camera that you see here, and it's what I use in my GoPro. 128 gigabyte variety. It's been bomb-proof. I really enjoy it. Now to run through the POV settings, they're very similar. There's just a couple key differences for running POV, starting with the lens. I run a super view lens that takes that 4:3 frame that I was talking about with the follow cam and compresses it all down to a 16:9 frame. So you get all that information in that 16:9, and it will make your shots look the most dynamic. And the rest of my settings are the same. I'll leave a link to some of the products I mentioned below. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out in the comments. I'm happy to answer any of them that you have. So that's probably a pretty quick rundown for you guys, but that took me almost an hour to film. That leaves us only 2 hours to get to the wedding. We got Bailey in the driver's seat. Step on it. Come on, Chip. One more.